So I'd like to introduce the next panel, which will be discussing token jurisdiction, a deep dive into SEC and CFTC Oversight. It's a theme of the day, I feel like. And it's going to be moderated by Katherine Dowling, who's the General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer of Bitwise Asset Management. And I'd like to ask the panel to join the stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, it's as bright as everybody told me back there. I realize this panel stands between you and lunch, but we've got a great group of folks from an experience standpoint, and rather than read their amazing resumes off a sheet of paper, I've actually asked them to each introduce themselves with a keen eye towards their touch points with market regulators. I'll start with you.
Sure. Tom Chippas. I'm the CEO of ErisX, recently acquired by Cboe and soon to be known as Cboe Digital. And we operate a spot cryptocurrency exchange as well as a derivatives exchange and derivatives clearinghouse.
Hi, I'm Caroline Pham. I'm a commissioner at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. I previously was at the commission right after Dodd-Frank, and I've also had experience in enforcement at the SEC, CFTC, and OCC. I was a managing director at Citigroup, where I had senior roles in compliance, legal, regulatory affairs, and then also head of market structure, working on the digital assets product roadmap. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carlos Domingo. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Securitize. We're a company that specializes in digital assets that are securities, that represent securities, regulated securities. We operate a number of regulated entities within the US, from a transfer agent to a broker-dealer to our ATS that allow us to basically manage the entire life cycle of a digital asset that is a security, from issuance, asset servicing, selling, and trading on secondary market.
Sam Brylski, regulatory counsel at Hedera Hashgraph, a layer 1 DLT platform. Formerly was the general counsel of an exchange, so I've had touch points with CFTC, SEC, FinCEN, a ton of different regulators within the space, depending on what activities I'm counseling on that day.
Thank you all. So at Bitwise, we do an annual survey, and no surprise, one of the biggest impediments to crypto adoption is regulatory uncertainty. So let's dive right in. Commissioner Pham, if we could start with you, please. If you could just lay the groundwork for the CFTC's oversight, what's clear, what's not, how would you like to see an evolution in that oversight with regard to digital assets?
So what really strikes me about this space is I first started covering Bitcoin when I was at the CFTC in 2013. And at that time, the Bitcoin Foundation had come to us and said, you know, do you regulate us? And we looked at it and we were like, well, it seems to be a thing that has value, but it also seems to be like a payments network. And it's really interesting to me about how here we are, you know, almost 10 years later, and we are still having this same debate. I mean, from the CFTC's perspective, I think the way that you look at it is that, of course, it's very clear that the SEC regulates securities, but then the CFTC has regulatory touch points with pretty much almost everything else. And so when you look at what the CFTC is, it is first and foremost a market regulator over a particular product, you know, commodity derivatives. And so the CFTC is there to be registering and regulating the rules for the market over exchanges, clearinghouses, dealers, market participants, making sure that the markets have integrity, have the ability to provide price discovery and risk management. And so what's been really interesting about the CFTC is not only did we first start looking at it, like I said, in 2013 or earlier, but the CFTC's actually come out first saying that Bitcoin is a commodity. You know, that was the seminal decision in 2015. And then the CFTC's continued to be leading the way in setting forth at least some regulatory clarity in the way that it can. For example, coming out and saying that Bitcoin, Ether, and actually also Litecoin is a commodity. But there's so much more that the CFTC is working on. And I think that as you're going to continue to see the engagement with Congress, with other market participants, the wonderful thing about having a principles-based regulatory framework is that it is flexible and we're able to adapt to what's happening in the markets more quickly and to address new risks more quickly.
Thank you. And Tom, I'm coming to you next here, all right? You've had a number of touch points with the CFTC. Your company, ErisX, was just acquired by CBOE. Can you just tell the audience what that experience was like and how it impacted your worldview with what is the ideal regulatory landscape that we're looking for here?
Sure. I mean, perhaps a little history would be helpful. So when ErisX was conceived and then launched, conception in 2018, launched in 2019, sort of picking up from some of the things Commissioner Pham just mentioned, talking about Bitcoin in 2013 and now, it's such a big difference, as you said. But even in 2018, as we were planning things, there wasn't a substantial more clarity other than there had been some derivative contracts released earlier and listed on CFTC markets. So we decided that from a spot perspective, we would go a similar path to others, and our spot markets operate under either money transmission or money service bureau laws, or in the case of the state of New York, money service bureau, as well as the New York State BIT license or virtual currency license. And then on the derivative side, we have both a DCM to operate the exchange and a DCO to operate the clearinghouse. So for us, the regulatory foundation was quite clear. We have this state regulation on the spot side, as the CFTC doesn't, in the main, regulate spot markets unless there's fraud or other bad things going on there where they get involved. And then on the CFTC side, it's very clear for derivatives, the DCM, DCO construct. That's the path we had been on and managed to acquire all the licenses we needed to operate in 51 states and territories and to operate the DCM and DCO. That took the better part of 2 years to acquire all those licenses. Fast forward to recent history with our acquisition by CBOE, and what you'd find is we certainly had to get various approvals. Really, the bulk of that approval work we had to do to get the acquisition approved was at the state level. Things at a federal level moved relatively quickly and easily, very straightforward. At the state level, we ended up having to get, I think it was 44 distinct approvals. So if you look at the elapsed time from when our transaction was announced in late October to when we just closed back on May 2nd, it took a while. It took quite a while to get all those approvals, and it wasn't as if it was an even distribution of those approvals. Some happened very quickly, others happened on the medium term, and then the sort of 80-20 rule applied, where that last little bit took the longest to get done. So that's sort of the foundational information about how we were regulated in the transaction. With respect to how it's impacted my view, certainly listening to Paul Bolsano speaking earlier and the senators in the previous panel, there's obviously a hunger for some, I hate using the word clarification. I think we're all better informed now, and there's just a hunger for how can we make this better rather than clarifying things. If you want to open a spot cryptocurrency exchange in the United States today, there are no lack of attorneys sitting here today that will tell you exactly what you need to do, and they'll get it done for you, and they'll send you the bill, and you'll be fine, and you'll be able to do it.
So, have them all stand up?
No, I probably know and have paid half of them, but no. But I would say that what characterizing it as clarification, I understand the urge to do that. I view it more as an improvement. And what are the improvements that one might make? Well, one improvement would be that you don't have to go seek approvals at the state level as we had to. I'm not complaining about that process, but I think on the facts you can say that wasn't the most efficient process it could be, so could we make that more efficient? The time to acquire all the licenses to operate a spot market is time consuming, and then you operate in a way that's very confusing to your end customers. You can do business with me in this state, but not in that state. It creates a lot of overhead and a little bit of regulatory risk if you're the operator. If someone sends you the license from when they lived in their parents' basement in the state where you have a license, but they actually live somewhere else, and you've done your best possible job with good policies and procedures, you could end up in trouble for doing that. So I would say that these attempts and the bills that are being put forth to clarify things on the spot side are generally welcome. I think they require a lot of consideration. It'll have an impact on the commission if they have to now regulate a spot market. It'll have, I'm sure the states will have something to say about this as well too. Certainly if we look in history, when the FinTech charter came from the OCC, there was a lot of input from the states on that. So I like the ideas. I think it could be more efficient, but there needs to be a thoughtful, deliberative process as to making sure that the things we make better won't create unintended consequences and that all the constituents are heard.
Thank you. Yeah, I think your theme of improvement 2 years is a long time. I think we can improve upon that.
I had Fabio-like hair before it started.
Absolutely. We want to see those pictures.
Exactly. I mean, I'd actually love to jump in because I
Please.
think you highlighted so many great points here. And so that's one of the things where a lot of these legislative proposals are really going to help create a more clear and holistic regulatory framework in the United States. But the CFTC already has a framework that's ready-made to go right now into the regulated sector for digital assets. And so that's one of the things that I think is great that people are realizing and recognizing as they go and expand their businesses and look into registered exchanges and clearinghouses. I think the other thing that people don't often realize, and it's something that I'd love to just sort of point out, is that the CFTC does currently have some regulation over spot markets. There's 2 areas in particular. There's one where, besides the Fraud and Anti-Fraud and Anti-Manipulation Authority, there's also retail Forex transactions, and then leveraged retail transactions in commodities. And so I think that's also something where it's good to look at the existing framework that's put in place and see how that could be adapted or a good model for greater regulation over the spot markets.
No, thank you. That's a great addition. And speaking of Fabio like hair, Sam, let's go next to you.
How about that?
You've been at an issue. You're at an issuer.
Yeah.
You've been at an exchange. Where have you come up to items that are broken that could be improved? Talk to us about how you see the world and what we can strive towards.
Yeah, well, a comment was made earlier about an attorney being able to come in and tell an innovator that wants to run a spot market exactly how to do it. And I think that's a little bit of an overstatement. I think it matters how these assets are classified, even when looking at spot markets. I mean, there are plenty of exchange running on money transmitter licenses, but do they also need an ATS from the SEC? How do they choose the assets that they list? How do they go through that process? So when you ask what's broken, I guess I'll start there. There's so many different places to go, but I'll start there and say I was at an exchange. This is 6 years ago now. And going through that analysis on how do you determine what type of asset is going to be listed on your platform. Having guidance to know how to categorize these assets is still something we don't have. We don't have anything, the SEC has made some statements, other agencies have made some statements, but they've not been applied very consistently, and so we're still doing a lot of guesswork. There's still a lot of guesswork, there's still a lot of gray area. I know attorneys that are still, counseling that you just need to pick an internally consistent framework and go with it. And at least you're then demonstrating that you're a good actor, but you may not be right at the end of the day. And that's still a pervasive view, I think, across all the legal counsels that I work with. So I think there's definitely room for giving firmer guidance. And I think in the absence of that guide star, that guidance, that formal guidance from regulators, there's just so much room for reasonable arguments. So many different people can make very reasonable arguments, and they can't really be proven wrong in that vacuum. So I certainly think that's one place for improvement.
Yeah. And Carlos, last but not least, what's the tenor in DC? We just heard from the senators. It felt very positive. What's your view on how the treatment of digital assets has evolved within Congress and DC, and what would you like to see from a legislative standpoint develop?
So we obviously talk mainly with the SEC because we deal with digital asset security, so that's the agency that we know the most, and we've been interacting with them since late 2018, early 2019. At the beginning, we just basically developed technology for managing digital asset securities, and there was a lot of lack of clarity of the space of the things that you could do or not, or what type of licenses, traditional license that you could apply to blockchain-based securities if you want, security tokens. So I think over the last 3 years, there's certainly been some more clarity, and we've talked to the SEC, as I mentioned, from several years ago. Last week we talked to the 4 commissioners, and you can tell that the level of understanding of the space is much higher now. They ask detailed questions: are you ERC-20 compatible? How you smart contract control transfer restrictions? Very detailed questions that 3 years ago we have to actually educate on that. So that thing is getting better. In terms of what new policies we need, I think that I'm going to be a bit controversial here, but we not only need regulatory clarity, but we also need a bit more enforcement, right? Because today what happens is regulatory arbitrage. So even though sometimes it's very clear what is a security or is not a security, if you can actually make it not a security, then you have a lot more freedom to do it. There's no any interactions you have to have with the SEC, there's no registration, there's no KYC, there's nothing that happens. And I can give you examples. We have companies in the industry that have, are issuing, I'll pick you one example. There's people issuing tokens that represent royalties against songs, right? So you basically buy the token and it gives you the future royalties of that song, right? That probably if you ask any securities lawyer here, will tell you that's a security, right? Because it's an investment contract that guarantees you the future cash flow of the work of somebody else, right? That's how we test. In the industry, there's companies that have done a token that does that, but they've added some sort of utility and then they claim it's not a security, and some people that are doing it as a security. The people that are doing it as a security, which are the ones probably not breaking the law, they're a huge disadvantage because treating things as securities makes you having to go through some sort of regulatory process like a Reg CF or Reg A+, or if Reg D, but then it's only for accredited investors. Like there's so many hoops. And then the fact that you do it on the blockchain adds complexity. And if something that will cost you 3 to 6 months work with lawyers to get it done, if you do it as a digital asset security, it's going to cost you a year and $1 million. And that put it at disadvantage the people that want to do things in a regulated way. And I think this is what we need to avoid, right? If the regulators want to regulate, they should regulate in a way that doesn't get on the way of people doing things, because otherwise people will find ways of avoiding regulations. And that's exactly what's happening today in the industry. I have customers that come to me and say, oh, we want to do a digital asset security. And I tell them what the process entails, and it's like, oh, no, I'll do a governance token or an NFT because that's much easier and I can just sell it to anybody I want. And that's problematic, right? So I think it's not just clarity that we need, but it's also enforcement of the people that are doing clearly illegal things, that they stop doing it, so people will choose the regulated path, and also I will say an easier path to be regulated, right? An easier path to comply with the law that doesn't take months and it costs millions of dollars in legal fees.
Yeah. I mean, the vast majority of the players in the space are trying to do the right thing, and we need that clarity so that they can do the right thing, so that they can come in, talk to the regulators, get an understanding of what the path forward looks like, and then take those steps. So, Commissioner Pham, turning back to you, what do you see as the biggest obstacle to getting to regulatory clarity?
Yeah. So this is an easy question for me to answer because I'll point to a different agency. I think, as everybody on this stage has just described, walking through the nearly 100 years of securities case law in this country, which informs us what is a security and the how we test and all the iterations on that, it is difficult to navigate. And I think that it probably is a good time for us to look at refreshing the regulatory guidance that is out there. The SEC had put out a 40-page framework around how to apply the how we test, but it's been a couple years now since that's happened. So, I look forward to seeing what the SEC does in this space. Because once you know what's a security and what's not, as everyone said, when you have those clear rules of the road, it facilitates compliance, but then it also promotes enforcement. And if it's not a security, then the CFTC has the authority to come in and do something about it.
Well, I don't know if this is going to change the Howey test, right? Because when we talk to them, it feels like that's what they think is
more
the test.
More guidance.
Yeah,
right.
You can make it easier to understand or more clear, right? But I don't know if that's what's going to end up happening, that they make it very black and white, right? Because things are not black and white at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. So I think that what they need to do is also make it easier for people to treat things as securities. Mm-hmm. Because, nobody wants to do things illegal. As Katherine said, most people are good actors here. But if they have an opportunity to play regulatory arbitrage, and they think that they're not going to get fined or they're not going to have a problem, they will do that, right? Because that gets on the way of doing business. And by the way, this is typical on the tech industry, not just now, but I mean, you can look at Uber or Airbnb or many companies before WeWork, et cetera, that they play this regulatory arbitrage to be able to move fast, right? So if the regulators get on the way of startups moving fast, then they're going to find these gray areas where they can actually play. So. Yeah.
No, I think you're bringing out a great point about public capital markets versus private capital markets, and how do we go about capital formation in this country. But it's a different regulator and a different panel. So.
Next year. Sam, do you agree? What's the biggest obstacle?
I mean, well, I'm certainly sympathetic to the argument that there is regulatory arbitrage going on. But I think I think one of the ways to bring the industry into compliance is to put out that clear guidance. First of all, make it easy for attorneys to advise their clients. Here's the exact reason why you need to go in. In often cases, we don't have things that we can point to. We point to a speech made by a former commissioner years ago that is anecdotal, and that's still cited when we give legal guidance or legal advice. And that's just not good enough. It's not convincing enough to some clients to take the actions that are going to severely hinder their the innovation that they're trying to achieve. And so I think there's certainly the guidance, getting the firm guidance from the agencies, but also having the agencies realize that they're regulating something that's very novel, has different characteristics than the instruments that they're used to regulating, and making sure that the innovators can come to them, get regulated, but also still grow and achieve the things they're trying to achieve. That's certainly a deterrent.
I think it's kind of like 2 steps, right? So the first thing is what we were discussing now, which what's a security, what's not a security, right? I think that for 90% of the cases, today the Howey test will tell you that things that are out there that are securities, people are treating not as security. Maybe there's gray areas in like 10%. So I think that in order to clean that up, enforcement is the only way to do it, right? Because if people continue doing it as not securities, things
but
are...
Carlos, where do we get that answer? It's not going to come just from enforcement.
Well, yeah.
So where do we get that answer outside of enforcement?
As I said, 90% of the cases are probably very clear, right? It's just that, people are ignoring and they don't want to listen to the answer. So, but the bigger problem is not only what's security, what's not security. The second problem is, okay, so let's say one of the digital assets out there that is worth billions of dollars, somebody says, okay, this is security. What do you do then? So first, how do you bring it back into compliance? Because these are not things that are easy to control as securities. They're tokens that can freely move across, anonymous wallets. Even if there's changes, you have KYC, you can move the tokens out and to another wallet, and there's no way to trace them as of today, et cetera. So the first thing is, how do you bring them into compliance, and what type of registration you do there for these things to continue being able to trade, right? Because you can't destroy billions of dollars in value, that a lot of it is on retail's hands. And the third one is who can actually trade them, right? Because today, crypto exchanges don't have licenses to trade securities. And then it's not clear whether, we have an ATS, where maybe an ATS is the way to do it, like us, or, other ATSs out there. Or, the other view is they need to be national exchanges, which I think will be very complicated to implement because of the difficulty to operate that, et cetera. So it's not just only clarity of what's a security or not, but also how do you bring things into compliance and where do you trade them?
Yeah. I think that's such an important point, because a lot of times when you look at, like you said, when you've got tens of billions of dollars in market cap for some of these tokens, are we looking at a shadow banking 3.0? And what do we do about that? I think this is why it's so important that we're working together with international regulators on coordinating and getting the global cooperation and coordination, because it's a global market. I think we have to have a global solution to it.
Agree. And Tom,
I guess I'd throw out something that doesn't get often talked about, and it might not be horribly popular, but the regulators have a lot on their plate, and there's a whole microeconomy built around complaining about what regulators have and haven't done, or the speed at which they're doing it. And that's fine, and for the people in that microeconomy, keep it up. But what I'd say is the folks in industry could do some very simple things to help progress this conversation in a more clear and orderly path. And it starts with not conflating everything into one thing. And by that, I mean saying we need one super regulator for everything that's digital, or by conflating Terra and Luna with USDC. I could go on a list of things that people conflate that do nothing but give people pause for confusion if their life's work isn't this space. I've worked in downtown Manhattan for a long time. The last time I can recall someone talking to me about stock certificates was at Hurricane Sandy when the DTC vault was flooded. Every security is digital now. There is no such thing as a non-digital security. So when people are innovating, or whatever label you'd like to give yourself, don't come and say that thing is a convertible debt that could become equity and call it something else. Say, I want to issue debt to go build something. And if it goes good, I'm going to flip it into equity and give it to people. Guess what? There are underwriters all over the street that will write something called a convertible bond. And then when it converts, they'll issue you equity, and it'll work. Don't come in and say, no, because of technology, this is totally different. The primitives are all there. There might be new efficiencies that create new questions, and there might be new products introduced. But at its core as an industry, we could really help ourselves by presenting things for what they are, not what we conflate them to be.
Actually, I would like to add one thing. Like a lot of the innovations in the crypto space could actually greatly benefit the securities markets, right? Because if you think about the two main things on DeFi today, and forget about whether DeFi is legal or illegal, whatever, I don't want to get into that discussion, but the two main innovations are, easy borrowing and lending protocols that allow people to basically borrow money against their assets, right? That's one thing. And the other thing is automated market making. How do you make illiquid things more liquid by allowing the holders of those illiquid things to contribute to the liquidity? Those are like the two main things, right? Like Aave and Uniswap, if you want specific examples. This could actually benefit greatly capital markets, right? Because you're full of places where you can't actually borrow money against your assets, or you're full of illiquid securities everywhere, right? So if we could actually bring these innovations into some sort of regulated framework, and we could apply it to capital markets, we can then really create this long tail of capital markets that doesn't exist today, right? And that's where probably blockchain has like the biggest impact in markets if that ever happens, right? So.
Yeah. Well, I think, but this is exactly the point, in that a lot of the promise of the technology and in digital assets, what you're really looking at is tokenization of real assets. You're just looking at a digital form and like a better marketing around existing financial products that we know what those are. And so when you look at sort of the infrastructure implications of what the blockchain technology can do to sort of modernize and make our capital markets more efficient, I think that's a lot of the promise here. But that's why I think it's really good that we have the established regulation around market infrastructures, and there are global standards for that as well, and we need to keep working on that.
So Commissioner Pham, is the CFTC the right regulator for this space?
Yes.
Would you agree?
I think I've voted with the last 4 years of work.
All right, there you go. Sam, what about you? What do you think?
Well, speaking of not conflating things, I mean, we're kind of, it's really easy to fall into a trap of just taking all digital assets and putting them in a bag and saying, how do we regulate this bag? And they're all so very different. And so it's really, it's almost not an answerable question. I mean, it depends on the product. It depends on the characteristics of the asset. There's a role for, if you heard on the earlier panels, there's a role for all kinds of regulators in the space. And that, unfortunately, makes it so much more complicated. I'd love if we could just put it in one bag and just say, okay, we're going to give these to the CFTC, and now I only have to talk to you. Great.
I think what Thomas said is important.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I'm sorry, I was being cute before, but honestly, I think that's a really important point, which is that because these are existing financial products, right? If it's the same risk and it's the same activity, it should be the same regulation. And so I think what all of us are trying to say is that when you know what it is, right, and it looks like a duck and it talks like a duck and it walks like a duck, that's the regulatory framework that goes with it. It's kind of trying to figure out when things might be a novel application of something, or it's sort of a hybrid because the technology allows you to sort of collapse, certain features together. That's where it requires a little bit more clarity and guidance.
I think just to say that all digital assets should be in one agency is probably the wrong approach, right? Because it depends on what it represents at the end of the day. And it might be some new stuff that doesn't exist, but NFTs is really not new, right? This is collectibles or art or things like that. It's just having to have a better digital representation. And these asset securities are securities. They just happen to have better representations and properties that can create new products or facilitate access or trading and things like that. And then there might be some digital assets that are commodities, and then they fall under CFTC, right? I think that the problem is that things are not black and white, right? And if it's always somebody who's going to try to argue about this is here or there, depending on what favors their business, right?
And even if an NFT, for example, matches an existing asset, I mean, the way it is implemented does create a different type of risk profile. So maybe it does fit in that same bucket, but I think there needs to be obviously some consideration for whether that fits in that bucket, but because of the nature of it, there's different risks that need to be regulated for.
Okay, so what is a security and what's not a security? This is the question, right? So we've got Commissioner Pham saying we need a refresh on the current construct that's out there. We have the digital framework. It has upwards of 60+ factors you have to look through. Cha-ching, lawyers, that's facts and circumstances, right? That is complex and it's hard to get through. So crystal ball, who do we look to get the clarity we need so that we can have our businesses stay on our shores and also have the path towards efficient answers to these questions? Who do we look to? Where do we find the answer? Tom.
Well, I mean, right, based upon what we know now, not what we're speculating about what could happen or may happen with some of the legislation and things that are proposed, I can point to our experience when ErisX was the first CFTC regulated exchange to list Ether, a contract for Ether. We went through the process of self-certifying that contract, and wherein in that process we had to answer questions about what is Ether, how does it work, is it a commodity, what have you. We went through that, and it was a relatively straightforward process. It happened in a very reasonable amount of time, and we were able to then release the product. So knowing what you know today, you can start with, is it a commodity? And if it's a commodity, the path is very, very clear. But then if it's not a commodity, I think it becomes less clear. And that's really the crux of what everyone up here has been speaking about. So I think from listing a product on a CFTC regulated venue, pretty straightforward. If you're going to do that and it's not straightforward, meaning you can't just very easily say this is a commodity, then you got a lot of questions to ask, and it would seem the clarity that many on the panel have talked about with respect to securities definitions would seem to be the place that provide the most help. I don't want to imply it's the only thing that needs to be done, but it would seem to me if you want to knock out the most questions and provide the greatest amount of clarity, that's where the utility would most derive from.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to flip that a little bit because the definition of a commodity is so broad. And so I think the SEC needs to provide more clarity to the extent that people are confused about it and coming to the SEC and talking to them about it. The SEC needs to provide more clarity on how you apply the definition of a security. When you know what's a security and what's not a security, then like I said, almost everything else, this CFTC has some regulatory touch points over it. But it's also important to realize that we're not just talking about like markets and trading products. There's also obviously like payment products, there's banking products, there's stored value, there's these other regulatory frameworks that are out there. And in the United States, we don't have a single financial regulator. And so that's why it is, because of our democratic system and also like federalism, we do have this matchup between like state regulation and federal regulation, but we have worked through that in so many different regulatory frameworks where you have state and federal regulation.
Carlos, do you agree?
Yeah, so obviously how it could be simplified, right? But at the bottom of it, and this is, by the way, not just in the US, but in most jurisdictions, a security is an investment contract, right? So it's something that, you're putting your money there, somebody else is working their magic out, and then you are going to make more money in the future. So it's something you buy to speculate with in the good sense of speculate because you're trying to make money with, right? So, and that simplistic view of the world, then, if you look at what happens in digital assets, I tend to agree that a lot of the things are securities because I don't know anybody, like today, we were talking about NFTs before, like NFTs space today, besides, outside some of the legit, like real artists, like Beeple and people like that, the other 99% of things that happen there, it's just people speculating with the NFTs because they think they're going to go up in value, and it feels kind of like the ICO era again, whitelisting, Discord channels, and people, shilling this and that before it happens, and so scams, things like that, right? So nobody is buying that NFT because they think the art is beautiful. They're just buying it because they think it's going to go up in value, and it's trading in an unregulated exchange, OpenSea in this case. So I think that there is no much question about those things. It's just lack of enforcement that allows people to continue doing these things that creates this arbitrage opportunity.
Sam, where do we get the answer? Where do you place your chip? You have one chip, and you have to place it in one place. Where are you placing it?
I don't think I can answer that exactly. I'm certainly sympathetic that there's investment contracts in this space. I want to point out, one piece of clarity we do need is when does an asset go from a security to a non-security? That was something that was hinted at by the SEC as a possibility. And so drawing that line, just because something was sold underneath an investment contract, from the SEC's own words, it can evolve into something else, and when does it go back? So I mean, it's I don't know where to put my one chip.
I think like one other point that I wanted to make is that when we're not talking about just a digital representation of an existing financial product. When we're looking at some of these novel, native crypto assets, tokens, I think what is striking is that many of these are some type of derivative. And when you think about that there's some kind of derivative, the CFTC regulates commodity derivatives, the SEC regulates derivatives based on a security. And so I think that helps us extend into looking at what I think is causing a lot of people the angst is these sort of novel and native crypto assets.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think to Sam's point on the when does something become not a security, I'll come back to my example. If I issued convertible debt, then it became an equity, and I decide to dividend out the assets of the company, there's a way to do that. It could be done a lot more efficiently nowadays. It could be done on public blockchains. It could be done in all sorts of ways. I don't know that we need to create a new asset class for that. I do think we should ask a lot of questions about, do new rules need to be created? Do new disclosures have to take place? Is there a new supervisory obligation? Those are all very good questions. But I agree with Commissioner Pham that a natively digital asset is going to drive new questions, things that we need to look at. I do think we have the majority of the answers there already if we wish to apply them, and then when we do, we'll find out where the gaps are, and we can fill in those gaps, as opposed to tearing it all up and starting with a blank sheet of paper, which I don't think would help anyone. It was very instructive last week during the House Agriculture Committee meeting when Chairman Scott pointed out in his summation at the end that so much hard work had been done over the years to make the CFTC-regulated derivatives venues capable of clearing foreign products and being equivalent. That was an enormous amount of work, and that is an enormous utility both to operators in the U.S. and to those that benefit from the operators in the U.S. We need to be really a little more thoughtful about that, maintaining our good standard, our high standard, maybe a little less concerned about the sense of urgency that everyone's going to go to Kyrgyzstan to open their new exchange because they can't do it in the US. It's just not going to be the case. Over a long period of time, competitive forces will play out, but we have a little more time than we give ourselves right now. Let's utilize those strengths that we have and not be so quick to cut them loose because we're worried about time.
But if the answers are out there and before us, what's stopping us? What's the obstacle? What's holding us back that we need to change? We have a lot of industry folks in the room. What do you want to tell these guys to go do to make this happen sooner?
Well, I can't opt into the microeconomy, but I guess what I would say is what I said earlier. I think your biggest bang for the buck right now is what you've been hearing here. Can we get some clarity on the security side? I don't think that'll answer all the questions, but man, it'll push us forward a long, long way. I think there's dialogue going on in that case. I think Chair Gensler has made a lot of comments in public forums that there's activity there. I think, as Commissioner Pham said, there's the constant open door that the SEC talks about to come in. So it's not going as fast as people like, but you've had two senators up here talking about their bills. There's another bill going through the House Ag Committee. There's activity. It's happening. So I don't know what else needs to be done right now other than we'd all in industry like to see that go faster, but I think there's a lot being done already.
Yeah. And it's more important that we get it right than we go fast. Although that's not something that everybody wants to hear, but we don't want to make the wrong decision here and really have people lose their livelihoods, and go under.
Commissioner Pham, the executive order,
Yes.
I imagine super helpful, given your background, CFTC work, to really help push the envelope with working with other regulators. Is that your view? And how are you using that background to kind of push your agenda within the CFTC?
Yeah, I'll say that the chairman is the one who leads the agency and represents the agency in all the interagency work, but I think that the president's executive order is something that's really useful in actually just gathering all of those resources across the whole of the federal government and directing them at solving the issues here and in coming up with a detailed report with recommendations touching almost every part of the economy. And what would it look like if you have digital assets with that? From all of the different risks as well as all of the different opportunities and benefits. So I think it will be helpful in that when the executive order the reports get published. I think there's a report that's published or released on September 5th, and there's another one that's due October 5th. is looking at those recommendations and then seeing how do we implement those recommendations.
Sam, do you think we have time?
I've been waiting for a decade now. I mean, I think, I look at FinCEN, and there's certainly problems on that side of things as well. But they first issued guidance in 2013 that makes it easy to point to when I'm counseling clients. Look at what they said. This is what they've followed consistently, and they've updated that over time. And do we have time? Yeah, but we need to get moving.
I just want to add one final thing. So it's not only about having regulations, but it's about how easy it is for you to comply with those regulations. Because today there's already regulations that we could apply in digital assets, right, or in digital asset securities. But if the fact that you do it with digital asset securities or digital assets takes 3 times longer than if you don't, and it costs you like 10 times more in legal fees, it disencourages people to actually comply with the law. So whatever new regulations that come out of this executive order, that's great, hopefully. But it's not just the regulation as well. As I said, it has to be easier for people to comply with them without having to go through a very, very lengthy and expensive process with the regulators to do it. So I think both things need to come hand by hand.
Great. Well, I've got 3 double zeros staring at me, so I'm going to wrap it up and say a big thank you to this panel, and thank you, everybody.